I'm going to go ahead and start the recording. And I want to welcome everyone to the June Pecan webinar. And it's kind of a difficult day to be inside watching a Zoom when it's so pretty outside. It actually is, it looks like it's probably hot out there. I'm probably not acclimated to it right now because I've been in the office so much and it's been so cool anyway. But I'm excited that I've been able to walk across my yard without sinking up to the halfway up my shoes lately. So, but I think we're going to get some more rain this weekend, but maybe not too much, except for those areas that may be needing some rain. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and going to talk about some of the things that are going on for June, what you need to be concerned about at this time. It looks like I need to switch my screens. Okay, Charlie, what are you seeing on your screen? I think you're muted.
Yeah, your presentation is up, but you're not in presentation mode.
All right, my screens have been giving me fits today. I've already been having some issues with that. So let's try it again. Now,
So you just need to hit presentation and
yeah, it's presentation on my other screen is the problem. Well, we'll go ahead and go through this, even though it's not pretty right now. But I wanted to talk about a few of the things from that calendar that are important to be watching right now. And so insect control, we've got some things that Phil's talked about, PecanNet caseware the last couple of months, and then be watching for things like aphids, webworms, walnut caterpillar, some of those things. And then also it may be time to start thinking about shuckworm pheromone if you've got had problems in the past. We also want to think about looking at conserving our moisture, and that may be using herbicides or mowing or grazing if you're in that situation.
Becky, it's still on the first slide.
Okay, I'm not certain why I'm having our computer guys out today, of course. Let me see if I can switch here. I have three screens, and that's always a problem.
Maybe if you just escape out of the presentation mode, then you can just go. Oh, there you go.
Okay.
Oh, perfect.
All right. So we will start back up. We'll talk about irrigation. If you are in an area that hasn't been receiving rainfall, you may be thinking about irrigating your trees, especially those young ones that are just getting started that you've just planted. We want to think about maintaining our grafts. And so those that have been grafting and you have new shoots pushing, those graft unions have taken, you may want to be tying some of those long shoots up to our bird perch or stakes to keep them from blowing out, and then selecting the most vigorous shoot to leave for your central leader. And then also continue with your zinc applications. At the research station, because we had so much ice damage, we're going to continue zinc. We're doing that about every 2 weeks on even our mature trees. Normally we just apply zinc in a mature orchard, maybe 3 times, 4 times. But on the trees that have a lot of damage, we're encouraging more applications of zinc this year because of the growth that we've got. And I'll show you some of those pictures in just a little bit. And then Wesley is going to talk a little bit about disease control and how to use the Mesonet application to be able to time our fungicide applications. And then I want to talk a little bit about the OPGA meeting that's happening next week, and along with the field day it's a week from Saturday. And then Charlie's going to be talking about training young trees and how to keep them in the good shape and the right structure to have nice, strong trees. So if you remember April 20th, this is what we looked at around this in several areas of the state. And I showed these pictures. And then on May 7th, we saw a lot of regrowth starting. And so some people were showing that they had very little damage, like that middle picture, and others had major damage. And it took weeks and weeks to ever get any regrowth on those trees. And so this picture on the left, they were just getting some regrowth on those trunks. So they had quite a bit of damage on their trees. So then I wanted to show you a little bit about what it looks like at the station just yesterday. And so we're seeing a lot, very, very many blooms on our trees. We've got a lot of fruit load. And so most of our pawnees that have shoots that are able to carry some fruit have a cluster. And our Kanza, they're kind of hit and miss. We have more of these vegetative shoots on some of those lower branches than our fruit clusters. But it's exciting to see there is a potential crop, even though we have about 50% of the canopy out there at the orchard. I'll show you a few pictures of what the trees look like as they're starting to regrow. And you can see, if you were tuned in earlier, Anne was asking about what do you do with all this new foliage and what do we leave? And Charlie was talking about, if you have regrowth on that trunk area or low areas, you're not going to want to leave that because it's going to be in your way. But you can see all these little tufts of new shoots that are pushing. And it's lighter green. It's they're growing pretty vigorously right now with all the water that we've received. But Dr. Lu Zhang, she's been doing some research out here on these trees that were damaged, looking at how zinc applications, we've got different rates of zinc applications, and then also looking at maybe changing our irrigation up a little bit to see how we can get these to regrow and be able to fill out that canopy better in a more beneficial structure. And so this is exciting to be able to see these trees renew. And like I was telling someone earlier, our Kanza orchard was really getting pretty tight with a lot of shade on the ground. And we were losing our production in between the trees because they were so close. So this actually may be a benefit to the trees to lose some of that canopy to renew that growth and get more area for new wood and new clusters. So it's pretty exciting. Some of the things that we've been seeing at the research station, of course, we've been keeping those zinc applications going. They just put out another application yesterday, and you can see all of the nice green, light green foliage where it's all that regrowth in that orchard area there. I think that's the Pawnee block. They're still continuing with herbicide applications, keeping those weeds at bay. We're seeing quite a bit of sawfly damage. And remember, this is not a caterpillar pest, actually it's a fly. And so some of the things that you might use like Confirm or Intrepid, they're not going to be killing this type of caterpillar pest or larva. But we don't usually treat for sawfly unless it gets really, really bad. And we usually see damage every year, but it's not extensive. We really haven't noticed much case fair activity at the station just yet, but it is time to really be monitoring those clusters and looking for eggs to know if we need to be applying any sprays. Most people that I talk to, they say, especially in the northern part of the state, that first week of June is when they apply their pecan nut case fair, but we know that that Phil's talked a lot the last couple of months about using trapping to help us know when we want to spray those trees for pecan nut case fair. One thing I had a few questions on is the certified pesticide applicator licensing. And a pesticide applicator license for the private category is issued for any person who supervises the use of restricted use pesticides. And those pesticides things like there's several insecticides, and then the tins that we use for fungicide applications are also under that restricted use category. But anyone who uses those restricted use pesticides for purposes of producing any ag commodity on their property or property that's rented or by an employer that is not compensated other than trading personal services needs one of these licenses. And so private applicators are people like farmers, ranchers, pecan growers, and those people that are using those restricted use pesticides. And so we've had some changes just recently over how these tests are done. And so we've started offering CEUs, or continuing education units. And so after June 1st this year, just this last week or this week, all of the new or renewing private applicators must test at a PSI testing center. And there's 7 testing centers around the state. You can go to that www.psiexams to find the locations to be able to register and schedule your test if you need to take that test. Just know that it's going to be given a little bit differently in the past. Now the test will be closed book and administered on a computer. Before, they were take-home tests or administered during a group setting. And so it may be a little bit different for some of our growers. Now, I want you to know that CEUs are not required to certify, but it is an option. So to retest, the exam is $65, the license included in that fee, but you need to travel to a testing site, and it will be a proctored exam. You'll have someone in there. You're not allowed to have any extra papers or anything like that. So if you do your CEUs to recertify, the relicensing fee is $20, but you're going to have to commit about 20 or more hours to be able to get enough CEUs to recertify. So you'll have to attend multiple meetings or go on some online meetings to be able to get these CEUs. So it is a little bit more of a long-term commitment. So I wanted to go over just a little bit about this and how we look at the recertification. So for private applicators and all the other certification licenses, they are on a 5-year cycle. And so for private applicators, that cycle's from 2019 to 2023. So it doesn't matter if you got your license in 2021, it's not going to be any good after 2023. So there's a definite 5-year cycle that you have to follow. You cannot receive your CEUs in the year that you were certified. So if you took your test just recently, you can't receive any CEUs until 2022. And then you can't get any more than half of your CEUs in any 1 year. But they want you to get at least some CEUs in 3 of the 5 years, if possible. Now, if you certify late in that cycle, you may not be able to get 3 of the 5 years, but you may just be for the 4th or the 5th year of the cycle. Now, the CEUs are prorated based on the year that you were certified. So if you took your test in 2018 or 2019, you would be required to get 16 CEUs before you recertify in 2023. If you got your license in 2020, you would only need 12 CEUs. 2021, you'd need 8. In 2022, you'd need 4. And so they weren't allowing private applicators to start acquiring these CEUs until just recently. So there's some changes. So private applicators will only need 16 CEUs this cycle. But next round, after this 2023, then they'll start requiring 20. But that's just because they didn't start letting anyone get CEUs until 2021. So the applicator that has his license is going to be responsible for signing in for these CEUs. for the training, and for whenever they sign in, they must put their private applicator number on that. And it has to be legible, because if you can't read it, it's not going to count. And if you see another CEU offering for ag plant or the 1A section, those are also going to be acceptable for private applicators. So there's going to be several different areas that you might be able to get these CEUs. Now, if you go to the pesticide safety education page, the link is right here at the bottom, pested.okstate.edu. You'll find some areas that you can get some more information. You can eventually, I'm not sure you can check for private applicators just yet, but you'll be able to go on this link right here, check your CEUs, and you'll be able to put your number in, and it will tell you how many CEUs you've required yet right now. And then you can also go to CEU meetings and find meetings that are going to be held around your area, or maybe online that you can get CEUs for. If you have questions, Kevin Shelton is our extension specialist for our pesticide safety education, and he's a great person to contact to get more information. But I'd be happy to help if I can as well. So I wanted to mention that because we are going to be offering some CEUs at our OPGA annual conference next week. So the meeting is going to be June 10th through the 12th at the Stony Creek Conference Center in Broken Arrow. I think registration online may be closed right now, but you'll be able to check that out at the okpecangrowers.com webpage. And if it is closed, you can go ahead and register the day that you attend. That we are having a mini pecan class on June 10th, Thursday, from 1 to 5, and there will be 2 CEUs available during that time frame. Phil Mulder is going to talk about insect problems for pecans, and then Charlie Graham is going to be talking about pecan diseases, and each one of those talks will be worth 1 CEU. So if you attend both of them, sign in properly, you can collect 2 CEUs towards your total that you need. And then the education program on Friday from 8 to 5, there will be 1 CEU available during those time frames. Saturday on that June 12th, we'll be moving from Broken Arrow to Edna. And there's probably not very many of you that have ever been to Edna, Oklahoma, but it's close to Bristow, between Bristow and Beggs. And we're going to go to the Isle Orchard and take a look at how they're growing their pecans along the Deep Fork River. At the trade show, we'll have lots of vendors and equipment people there. I heard there's, I think, 26 booths that are going to be available at that equipment show. And we have a pecan food show, and the state pecan show will also be displayed. So if you have the ability, I'd really encourage you to attend our meeting. Just wanted to tell you that we do have another Zoom schedule for July 9th, one for August 6th, and one for September 10th. Remember that you do need to register each time for each different session. And here's my contact information. We have our webpage that has all of our fact sheets and other information listed on that. Lots of great videos that you can use as resources. And then our Facebook page at OK Pecans. Try to keep that updated with timely topics that are happening right now. So are there any questions about any of those things that we were talking about just now? Anything on CEUs or anything like that? All right. Well, we'll go ahead and move on and have, let's have Charlie go ahead and talk about his pruning young pecan trees.
All right, can you see that, Becky?
I can see that, yes.
Okay. All right, we're just going to start by a little refresher right quick on pruning young trees and stuff like that. Of course, our big objective we're trying to do with pruning a young tree and everything is make sure as that tree matures and everything, it can withstand weather, crop load, if you have heavy crop loads, your harvest operations, any cultural practices you have to do, such as hedging or things like that, as well as your pest control operations. So those are kind of the things where you have as an objective when we're trying to prune a tree up. And when you look at the reasons to prune, I mean, we're usually trying to control tree size or shape a tree up, or we've had storm damage. We're trying to correct injuries from the storm damage, or we're using hedging to control the bearing process on mature trees. And often when you're looking at that, the types of cuts you're going to be making are heading or thinning cuts. And this just gives you an idea. If you were to leave that tree alone and not do anything to it whatsoever, you can see all the different issues you may have with limbs growing down and poor crotch angles and limbs rubbing on each other. And what we're really after is to have a more uniform tree with the limbs a little more evenly spaced out and good strong angles and everything for strong limbs to be able to handle a heavy load. This is what we're trying to avoid. I'm sure a number of you saw that from the ice storms this past year in the northern part of the state. So we're trying to avoid that by, structurally making the tree as sound and strong as we can. And you'll hear some examples of some trees that are older that did not receive any pruning when they were young. You can see you have, what would have been, a crow's foot with 3 branches all at the same location. And ultimately under a heavy load of ice or a heavy crop load, oftentimes the situation you're going to have is they're going to look like this at the end of it. And it's not uncommon to see, Y trees or those with 3 scaffold limbs under a heavy load or ice or crop load to just split down the center and all 3 go to the ground or both go to the ground. So that's what we're trying to avoid in the training process. Here's just another example. You can see this narrow crotch angle, the occluded bark that you have for almost a foot down where it attaches together, and one of those are going to break out sooner or later. It can even happen on older trees. I've seen trees that were 4 or 5 foot in diameter, and you lose a scaffold limb down low that is the size of a 30-year-old pecan tree, but just happens to be a large scaffold limb that breaks out. So this can happen young in the tree's life, or it can happen 50, 60 years down the road. Here's an example under an ice load right here on a central leader tree. You can see the tree is withstanding the weight of the ice pretty well. Whereas when you compare that to one that say maybe has a Y crotch in it, you can see how the tree is starting to split open. And as you continue to accumulate ice, generally one of those sides, you can see where it's splitting is one of those are going to break out, and often that weakens the other side and both may go. So for the central leader, like I said, we're looking for wide angles. We're looking for balanced scaffolds, and you're going up the main central leader, and that's what our goal is. Just to give you an idea about why that breaks out, if you look at on the left, you can see where the bark is that narrow crotch angle, the Y's and everything, where you have a lot of trapped bark. That's just dead wood that gets trapped between the two as they both increase in diameter. And so with the wider angle, you have solid wood all the way through that crotch angle. And that's what allows it to withhold the rigors of a heavy crop load or ice load. So here's an example of too narrow of a crotch angle. This is on a younger tree, and you can already see the bark being crushed in on that particular one. Where you have wider angles, you don't have that situation occurring. And so that's what we're after. So if we're looking at pruning, generally, as we talked about earlier, the pruning is just to remove a portion of the tree to correct or maintain the structure. And like I said, with training, we're doing training on young trees because we're trying to direct all the growth that's occurring this year, to be in wood that we're going to keep at the end of the season and have little pruning to do in the dormant season. So you can, start in active growing season and train trees during the growing season to reduce the amount of pruning that we have to do when they are dormant. You don't have to have very much to do pruning on young trees. I mean, usually just a pair of hand pruners. Sometimes you might need a lopper or something, but if you're doing young trees, often just your hands or a pair of hand pruners will be sufficient to handle anything that you need to do. We talked about this probably 3 or 4 months ago when we planted the tree, and we put the tree in the ground and we've cut the a third of it to half of it back to start growth on a young planted tree and everything. So we're going to move forward from there. Just to remind you, if you look at any node on a pecan tree, typically you're going to have a primary bud, a secondary bud, then a tertiary or a latent bud. So you can have 4 buds per node. But what you need to remember is when you're training these trees is those different buds will give you different angles when you're training the tree. Primary buds are usually very erect. Often they will give you very narrow crotch angles. That's the reason we leave a primary bud at the very top of the tree. Like if you go back and look, at the top of this tree, at the very top, we leave a couple of primary buds on the first 2 nodes. But then we generally will remove the primary buds and allow the secondary or tertiary buds to form, because they're going to come out at a much wider crotch angle and a much stronger limb angle than the primary bud will. So we use primary buds to develop our central leader on the tree, and we use the secondary and tertiary buds to form our wider crotch angles on our scaffold limbs. Why do you have issues on these young trees? If you don't cut the top out of it, as a young tree slows down in growth at the end of the fall, you can see how at the very top of the shoot on the left, how all the buds pile on top of each other, because you're slowing down growth as it gets colder into the fall and everything. And so all the buds wind up being on top of each other. And when it puts out in the spring on the right, you can see you have a number of shoots all originating from the same location, and they often have the same vigor. And that's where we pick up these crow's feet or these Y branches and things like that we have issues with. If you were to drop down and cut 4 or 5 inches back to that bottom bud, you can see you have now just a single shoot coming out, which will give you a good straight central leader. So that's the reason we cut those back and use that primary bud further down, just to have 1 limb growing instead of multiple limbs coming out on the tree in the springtime. So if you're looking at summer train, this is something a lot of people think they have to wait to train a pecan tree. You don't have to wait for it to grow an entire year and then in dormancy go through and prune the tree back to try and correct its growth. And this is something you can do during the summertime. I often will train trees at least 2 or 3 times during the summer, depending on how much growth I'm getting. And so we're removing shoots that are competing with our central leader. And we're going to head back strong growing shoots, so we have just 1 leader and not multiple leaders trying to compete with each other. And like I say, any of these small training cuts that you make now is just going to reduce the amount of larger cuts you're going to have to make later on in the wintertime. Like I say, generally you can just do most of this just with a pair of hand pruners. You don't have to have any big equipment, no chainsaws or loppers or anything like that. And just this gives you an example. You can see the winds coming, from the south. That's our predominant wind. So we try to train our trees so that they're growing into that prevailing wind, because that keeps the tree from growing straight and not be a leaning tree if you choose the other side. So here we had a Y crotch angle. Basically, we've got multiple shoots. So you're going to go in and you're just going to remove one side. And I've left the side that's going into the prevailing wind, and that's going to become my central leader. And that's what we'll continue working with. I'm going to give you multiple examples right here. We're going to go through them pretty quickly. Generally, you're going to come back and cut those off at the point where they attach to the trunk where that central leader is coming. That way it won't be competing with that one. But here's another example. You can see you have multiple shoots, all about the same vigor, all about the same height, and we don't want those to grow the entire year and have to take half the tree off anyway. So you can go ahead and correct it now and go ahead and remove part of that tree, cut those other shoots back, pinch the tops out of them, or I'll do a heading cut and cut them back partially and allow that central leader to become dominant in the tree. Here's another example. You can see the arrow pointing to the one I've chosen for this particular central leader. So I'm going to prune back those other ones. And here's another example now where you can see I have multiple shoots, but they're all about the same vigor. There's 4 shoots at the top of this particular tree. And I don't need to let those grow for the entire summer and let them be 5 or 6 feet long and have to cut all those major shoots back. When I can go ahead in the summertime right now and go out there and prune those other limbs back and allow that central leader to be formed, and for all the energy of the leaves down below it to be making food to push into that central leader. That way I get to keep most of the growth I produce this year instead of losing 2/3 of the growth I produce this year. Here's another example, and they're not multiple competing shoots. You just have 2 side shoots, one off going with into the wind and one going away with the wind. And so I don't have a leaning tree. I cut back the one on the left. I leave the one on the right that's going into the prevailing southerly wind, and that'll be my central leader on that particular tree. on all those trashy limbs down at the bottom, you can allow those to stay there. You can just take your fingers and pinch that growing tip out. That'll stop them from elongating, in the shoots from elongating anymore and cause side branching. But all those leaves on the bottom are just going to continue to make food that's going to be forced into that central leader. So you have really good, strong growth for the rest of the year. As those lower branches get to be larger in size, say in a year or two, when they're an inch in diameter, you can go through and cut those bigger limbs off once they reach almost an inch in diameter and leave the smaller limbs and continue feeding that trunk until you reach the point you need to take all those off, either for herbicide reasons or you can't have a sleeve there to protect against that, and just leave the trashy trunk right above the sleeve that you have on the trunk. Here's a final example from summer pruning, I think, and you can see I've got the one that's, I have a fairly large limb going off to the right, which is just too much of an angle, I felt like. So I cut that limb off back at the main trunk, and I left that central one, and I pruned the ones on the left back a little bit, but leaving the leaves on those to continue making food and work on that central leader. Just to kind of follow up, I'm sure we'll go over this much more later on in the summer, maybe our last meeting we have on the Zoom or first thing next spring, but just to touch base a little bit on some of the dormant pruning and what you might expect after this season. Many of you have probably had a tree that grew the entire season and this is all that you got. And the tree just not grow well. You've got like 1, 2, 3, 4, you got 7 shoots, 8 shoots there, all only an inch or two long, and you just don't have any good vigor right there. So the easiest thing to solve that problem in dormancy is to just get rid of it, start over. I mean, it's just like you put the tree in the ground, get rid of that mess, start with a nice new shoot, and you'll get it to be vigorous and develop your central leader from that. And you're going to lose a year, but it would be much easier to start fresh than it would be to try and salvage something out of that group of small branches where you didn't have good vigor. Same kind of situation right here. You can see the glove finger is pointing toward our crow's foot. We've got 3 shoots originated at the same point. So we can just get rid of that and use the shoot underneath it and cut the limb to the back on the left side back a little bit so it won't compete. We may have to come back on that left limb and pinch it back again if it gets to be too vigorous and we're trying to develop the shoot on the right hand side. A little bit larger tree here, but same situation. We got multiple limbs all originating at the same points. We're just going to drop back down and go with that right shoot and let the wind carry it up and straighten the tree out and have that as our central leader. If you haven't been pruning at all, maybe you've ignored it for 2 or 3 years, you may have trees that look like this in dormancy. And now is the perfect time to take care of that situation. You don't want to let the trees get 10, 12, 15 years old and have to take, a foot diameter limb off the side when you can handle it right now, even on this little bit larger tree. Go ahead and take that Y out. Just go ahead and cut one side of it out and continue growing your tree. We've chosen the side to the prevailing wind. We'll let the wind help straighten that tree back up. And now you have a much better looking tree that's going to be more structurally sound. Same situation in this particular case. All the growth is to one side. They put a stake in the ground and tied a rope to it, trying to pull the tree straight and everything. Typically, that's not going to work that well for you. It's easier to prune the tree and use the growth that's growing straight. If you look to the right-hand side, you've got a scaffold limb that'll work. So you can just prune that left side off that's leaning, take the pole out of the ground, and take the rope off, and just straighten that tree up by pruning. And in a year or two, you won't even notice that you've taken all that wood off. In this situation, here we have 3 equally growing limbs. As I said, we don't have to wait for an entire year and have these 5, 6, 7 foot limbs on a tree, because now we're going to take all of those off. As you can see on the far right, we've had to remove all but one, and we chose that as our central leader, and we cut that back to continue training it. But there's no reason to let those go the entire summer when we can go out there when it's young succulent shoots with a pair of hand pruners and correct most of that and channel all the growth that we have during that year into our central leader, not into multiple competing branches that we're going to have to take off anyway. I always get the question, I've pruned some trees for some people, and I think they almost passed out when I got through cutting the trees back. Can you over prune a tree? That's always a common question that you get. So here we had a grower that actually came to Noble and went through a training session here, and he went back to his own place and he decided he was going to prune some of his trees up. So you can see how many limbs he has on this tree. I mean, it's a modified central leader tree. He wanted to straighten that up and get back to a central leader. So he removed all this. He got it down to one limb in the center and one side shoot that he cut back. You think, oh my gosh, he's destroyed that tree. He's probably not even going to live. 3 months later, the tree looked like this. So obviously, you prune a tree back hard. Pecans have what we call compensatory growth. The more wood you cut off of them, the more they try to replace all that wood that you've removed. And so you can use that to your advantage in the training process. And you make some of those stronger cuts, you're going to get a lot of vigorous growth. And as long as you channel that vigorous growth into the wood that you want to keep for the year, have in your mind the visual to see the tree that you want to have and remove the stuff that you don't need, put all your growth into wood you're going to keep and not what you're going to have to cut off later on. So remember, the first 4 years after planting, and this is probably one of the most important times to develop your tree's framework. All the choices you make over the next 4 or 5 years, you'll be able to see in the rest of that tree's life. What you did now, if you left Y angles or narrow crotch angles, you'll see those from now on. So, this is important 4 to 5 years once you put the tree in the ground. As we talked about earlier, the secondary and tertiary buds, they're going to produce a much wider crotch angle than what primary buds do. So use that to your advantage. When I'm selecting my scaffold limbs, I use a primary bud for that central leader at the top, but I only leave a couple of those at the top, and I remove the primary buds down that chute when I want to select for my scaffold limbs, because that's going to give me a wider crotch angle with those secondary and tertiary buds. And that kind of wraps things up.
Charlie, we had a couple of questions in the chat. I had one, Phil asked if there are any advantages to pruning very young trees before you graft, maybe next year.
Well, you can prune back those side branches, because if you're going to do, say, an inlay bark graft, you want to have a nice, just straight piece of wood that you're going to use to graft onto, depending on what size of tree you are. So I'll remove some of those side branches and try to choose my spot that I don't want any branches to develop on the area I'm going to graft. So I'll choose that spot and try to keep it as clean as possible so I have a good grafting surface next year. If it's smaller trees, choose 1 or 2 that you can use for a banana graft or a 4-flap graft, and make sure those are nice or clean and strong. You can remove some of the lower branches under there, and that'll help out in the grafting next year.
All right, and then Daniel asked, how close to the central leader should I cut an unwanted limb?
Generally, I'm going to cut it back all the way to the trunk, unless I'm just leaving it for leaves, and then I'll just, take the tip out of it. For instance, right now, you probably have about 1 foot of growth on a lot of trees. I would just pinch the tips out on the side branches and leave that for a trashy trunk, but that stops the growth of those side branches, and then concentrate everything in the central leader. Then it's those smaller, those branches that are lower down that I'm not going to keep. I'll cut those back to the main trunk when they get about 1 inch in diameter.
Any other questions?
Unless they're getting in the way of your herbicide. If you've got limbs that are low and you're trying to do a herbicide strip, you may have to limb some stuff up so you can get under there and not get herbicide on the tree.
That picture where you have the tree with the 2 and you took off half of it, I always tell people it hurts you less if you take care of it when it's much smaller. It's really difficult on the pruner to take off half of your tree. So if you can make those cuts when they're very small cuts, it's going to give you less heart attacks to have to make those cuts. So, and also pruning those major limbs out, like that guy that had the 3 limbs in one area, that's a lot of work compared to little hand clippers going along and taking out a small little shoot. So like Charlie said, any of those things that you are making those cuts early in the life of that tree is really going to affect what you're going to see as that tree grows. More time you spend on the training when they're early, the better shape the trees are going to be in as they start producing. Any other questions for Charlie? All right. Thank you very much, Charlie. Appreciate it. And let's see if we can get Wes to share his screen. Wes is our extension specialist in biosystems and ag engineering, Wes Lee, and he is probably he's got the most, let me see, it's, his office is located on the OU campus. I don't know if it's considered OU, but he's in Norman at the National Weather Center. And so he's one of the only OSU employees that is housed there on that campus area. And they're friendly to him down there at OU as well. But we're proud of Wes and what he's doing with the Mesonet at for our state. And they provide a lot of great information for our growers. So can you go ahead and start your, there we go, that looks great.
Okay.
Thank
you for allowing me to come today and visit with this group. Becky asked me to come and visit with you about our Pecan Scab model, but she also gave me permission to share with you something I thought was pretty interesting based on what she talked about at last month's Pecan update. And I want to start with that with a couple of slides that deals with the what Becky referred to as the late freeze in April. Statistically, it really wasn't all that late, April 21, but part of the biggest concern is at least in central Oklahoma, we had been 6 weeks since the last freezing temperature before we got the April 21 freezing event. So here's some data from that particular morning that we have. If I can, there. I wanted to point out a couple of things. Get this screen where I can see it. A couple of things that we measure on a Mesonet tower. We have multiple different sensors, and a lot of times we measure the same thing at a couple of different locations. You know, the standard air temperature height that you see on the news reported on a nightly basis is from the standard height of 1.5 meters. But we also have a temperature sensor higher up on the tower that would represent, temperatures further up into the canopy of a tree at 9 meters or about 30 feet. So here is from that morning of 4/21. Notice that close to the ground at Perkins, which was the pictures that Becky was showing you a month ago, the temperatures close to the ground were running about 29 degrees. But if we looked higher up into the canopy, we see the temperatures were about 31 and a half. In there. So that was an interesting phenomenon. It may be why you're seeing, parts of your trees frozen close to the ground, but higher up in the canopy, we still have a nice fruit set at that location. Now you might say, well, how could that temperature vary that much in just about 7.5 meters? Well, one of the reasons is from the wind speed. We also measure wind speed at two different heights. Again, the standard wind speed you see on the news at night is at 10 meters, but we also measure wind speed at 2 meters or closer to the ground. And here you can see that close to the ground, the air was just not moving. We weren't getting any kind of circulation, but as we moved up into the canopy or higher into the atmosphere, then we started picking up a little bit of air movement that kind of kept those temperatures a little bit warmer. Now, if we looked at the state as a whole, this is what we call an inversion map. An inversion is anytime we have a warm layer above a cool layer. So if that 1.5 meter was cooler than it was at 9 meters, which if the 9 meters was warmer, then we actually have a temperature inversion. Now that is not uncommon. Most nights we do have a temperature inversion, but on this particular day when we had the freeze, we had some really significant inversion temperatures. So the entire state was under an inversion. And if you look at the Pecan County area, the Perkins station's coming in at this particular time at 2.3 degrees Fahrenheit. But we had a few locations in the state that were running as high as 7 and 8 degrees of a temperature inversion. So this pretty much statewide 2 to 3 degree inversion is, again, one of the reasons we're having some decent fruit set, maybe off of the higher up in the canopy off the ground, but those clusters or fruit sets closer to the ground just are not there this year. Well, Becky asked me to visit with you about our Pecan Scab model. It's part of the Oklahoma Mesonet. And as she mentioned, I am housed here in Norman at OU, but I'm a 31-year veteran of OSU and employed through the Biosystems Department out of Stillwater. our Mesonet stations, most of them went into existence the start of 1994, January 1 of 1994. We have 120 towers across the state. And the product that I'm going to talk about, if you use our tool, you can just select the Mesonet station that's closest to your trees to utilize this product. The Pecan Scab Advisor is one of about 16 what I like to refer to as value-added tools that we take the raw weather data that we collect from these towers every 5 minutes, and we put it into a tool that helps farmers and ranchers make decisions. So let's get into the Pecan Scab Advisor and spend a little bit of time talking about it. To locate the Pecan Scab Advisor, you can go to our website on any search engine and type in mesonet.org. That's our URL or our location on the internet. Once you're here, you'll be able to select the agriculture tab to look at those value-added ag tools. I might mention that I am locked on for this presentation to the Ardmore website there. You just heard Charlie speak, and he's at the Noble Foundation at Ardmore, so we're going to stick with Ardmore for this presentation. Once you open up the agriculture tab, you see that it opens something called the Farm Monitor. Now, a lot of producers like to leave it open on this page because it has a nice synopsis of the weather information, a short-term forecast, as well as some valuable information to look at. One of those points of information is actually the pecan scab that you can see at the bottom here. So at a glance for Ardmore, we can see that we have a pecan scab infection hours of 34. And I'll explain that a little bit more as we get into it. But that's a quick glance that you can take a look at pecan scab. But if you want to actually open the tool and do some of the interactive features, you have to open up then from this ag section, the horticulture tab. And in the horticulture tab, of course, for today, we're going to look at the pecan tools. So let's open that up, and you'll see on the left-hand side that we have the Pecan Scab Advisor highlighted. That opens up the scab page and gives us 4 big green buttons that we call radio buttons. So we're going to click through these 4 buttons, and I'll explain to you what each one of them does. Before we do that, I need to explain what a pecan scab hour actually is. That's how we report the infection or the potential infection is in scab hours. And what a scab hour is anytime we have a temperature at or above 70 degrees Fahrenheit, along with a relative humidity at or above 90%. Now, those hours are added up in there, and we keep track of them on a rolling 14-day added up average. Now, pecans are not the same. As you know, you've heard your specialist talk numerous times. Some pecans are more susceptible than others. So we divide the pecans into 3 different categories, either highly susceptible, moderate, or low susceptibility. Now, the threshold of calling for a spray would be when we have 10, 20, or 30 hours, depending on what variety you're planting. Now, back on our website, there's something called the Learn More tab, and there you can actually see a page on how to use this tool if you want to go through a step-by-step instruction, or you can see the pecan varieties that we have broken out here that fit into each one of the categories. This chart may need to be updated, but it does have some of the newer varieties that have been added in the last few years. Okay, once we clicked on that first radio button, that would show us the pecan scab hours for the last 14 days across the state. Now, I put this slide set together a couple of days ago on June 2nd. Hasn't been a lot of change since then, so this would still be fairly current if we were looking at the screenshot live. But on June 2nd, you can see that we had infection hours from a high of 49 to down in the southeast to a low of 0 in the panhandle on this particular day. You can also look at this map for the entire growing season, which defaults at March 1. and goes through 8/31 of that year if you wanted to look at accumulative hours across the state. Now, going back to that Pecan Scab Advisor page, we'll move down to the second radio button, and that is a local Mesonet site. Again, here for Ardmore, when you focus in on one particular site, it shows you over the last 14 days when those hours were actually accumulated. So you can see here on this chart, we started accumulating hours on May 22nd, and they added up till about May 28th, and then things kind of settled off. So in the red are the actual measurements from the Ardmore Tower. And then because of a relationship we have with the National Weather Service here in Norman, we utilize one of their forecast models or forecast tools to look for a 3.5 day in the future to get an idea of what we estimate pecan scab hours are going to be for the next 3.5 days. On this particular day, you can see in the blue area or the forecast area, we didn't add or didn't expect to add any more infection hours to this model. Back onto the main scab page, we'll look at what I like is it's our spray advisor tool, and this will allow you to provide some information from your particular orchard and give you an idea of whether a spray is necessary on your orchard. Now, I might mention, as we talked before the program started today, I know Dave mentioned he doesn't have a nut set in his pecan orchard, so the model doesn't know that. So if you're not, do not have intentions of spraying a harvestable crop this year, this tool's not going to be as useful to you as it would be in years when you're really trying to protect that crop. This spray decision advisor, you have to enter in a couple of more information components here. One is the pecan variety. How does your variety that we want to look at, how does it break down into those 3 different categories? So here I've selected moderately susceptible for this demonstration. Below that is a start date. Now, it should say spray date, in my opinion, there, and that may be something we need to add to that in the future. But if you've not sprayed this year, then it would be the start date, whatever day you want to plug in. But if you have already sprayed a fungicide in your orchard, that would be the date that you need to put into this start date category right here. And I'll show you why here in just a second. Once you hit the Get Data button, again, we're on Ardmore. You can see that June 2nd, when I produced this map, it shows I plugged in that I made a fungicide application on May 10th. It makes the assumption that your fungicide is going to last 2 weeks. So that means that we don't worry about infection hours between May 10th and May 24th on this particular example. But if you feel like your fungicide doesn't last 14 days, you could fudge that number a little bit by adjusting your spray date. Now you can see, I don't know if I've got a cursor or not, but you can see a green button in the upper left-hand corner that says no spray, or it's not recommended to spray, because of the data that we plugged in, that moderately susceptible that would require 20 hours. We have only accumulated 16.75 hours, so it's not reached the spray threshold according to this model. If it had exceeded the threshold, this would have a red button that would say, recommended to spray. Okay, the last radio button on the Pecan Scab page is just something to kind of compare previous years to what's going on this year. So if we click on the past years and then we're to look at a 3-year comparison graph, as of June 2nd, you can see for Ardmore, the 3 different years at this particular time. We see that 2021 is running really high compared to the last 2 years. That wouldn't be the case if we went, to different, more westerly or more north, but the southeast this year is really adding up some infection hours. For those of you that grow in that part of the state, you probably already know that. So this is a nice way just to give you an idea. Is conditions better or worse than they were the last couple of years? You can also look at this in a table format if you want to. Now what I've been showing you is the is the website, Mesonet website that you can access, but we also have an app that you can use on either platform, the Apple or Android platform. The only thing, though, that you can look at on a phone is that 14-day map that shows, the infection hours over the last 14 days. This is in the map section of the phone app. And then once you're in the map section, you would click on Ag Advisories, and under there, you'll see the pecan scab to take a look at. So at this current time, that is all we can do, is just to look at the map. We don't have the interactive tool as far as the spray schedule or to look at previous years or things like that. I mentioned that the pecan scab is operational. It's seasonal tool. It operates from 3/1 to 8/31 of each year. So, if you look in February, this tool is going to be turned off on there, or after, if you're in October looking at it, it is turned off. I might mention that I will be at the Pecan show next week. I'll have a booth there. If anybody would like to look at these tools in more depth, or you have some questions you'd like to visit one-on-one, be love to visit with you at the Pecan show next week. Becky, that'll conclude for me and get us on time, I think.
All right, well, thanks, Wes. Appreciate you joining us today and explaining I think it's a great way to be able to schedule those sprays for pecan scab. And so it's always interesting. I love to look at the weather and the maps and things that Mesonet can provide us as growers. So it's really interesting. Like that inversion map, I thought that was really telling to show the differences in how we might be able to employ some helicopters or wind machines or something to be able to bring some of those warmer temperatures from up higher down into the orchard floor. And so that's really interesting to me.
That inversion map is one of the standard tools that are on the Mesonet website all the time under the temperature section. So you can see that statewide inversion map anytime you want to.
Okay. Is there any questions for Wes or for Charlie or myself today? All right, you're welcome to put them in the chat or just turn your microphone on and you can ask a question if you're interested. All right. Well, I don't see anything there, but I appreciate everyone tuning in today. And I hope to see several of you next week at the OPGA meeting. And it's always a great time to get to visit and see everyone. And it's been a couple of years for many of us to get out and get together. So it's going to be a lot of fun to see everyone. And I know several of our attendees aren't able to travel internationally to come to our meeting, but maybe someday when you're here, you can come visit us as well. So thank you to everyone. And we will see you at the OPGA meeting or next month in July at our next webinar. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Becky.
Thanks, Phil.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kuhn. Bye, Maria.